Hi, everybody. I'm Ryan Clay. I am Director for Market Innovation at Evidation Health. And the paper I'll present right now, we wrote in partnership with Jen Goltak of the DiGBiom Society. This is the Digital Medicine Society. It's a non-profit run in the US that promote the adoption and expansion of digital medicine, which includes digital measures. And we wrote this paper today, or that we're going to present today, really because it really genuinely does take a village to develop digital measures or really any kind of digital health product. And we realized that there's a lot of guidance and frameworks out there for clinicians, for clinical operations, for regulatory people, for executives, but there's really nothing out there that specifically focuses on people coming from an analytics background. And this is a real problem because, frankly, the analytics is oftentimes one of the most important components in that village. So much of digital health goes towards the interpretation of data, and ultimately making very simple statements out of very complex data. And so we wanted to try to rectify that gap a little bit and help everybody communicate with each other and really sort of highlight some of the hurdles, I would say, in digital measure development, that where analytics and people coming from a CS background have a particular effort or a particular role to play, and to really help them contribute and enable them to communicate their results and what they're seeing to the rest of that team that isn't coming from that analytics background. And so the paper really starts out with just a very simple lexicon, really just trying to get everybody speaking the same language. And so we talk a little bit about the settings in which digital measures are used and they're developed, where the different use cases will actually get their validation data from, and the different paths or different validation paths open to them. Ultimately, the aim of many digital measures, which is an umbrella term that we use that refers to all kinds of, or at least partially objective measures collected in sort of the healthcare space. Ultimately, the aim is often to drive some kind of decision making, and there's different ways that you can reach that endpoint, and ultimately to be qualified as an endpoint, which is what is required if you're going to be using the results of your analysis of your system to actually be influencing decisions that patients are making themselves, or that doctors and healthcare providers are making for their patients. And so we talk a little bit about the differences between a biomarker and an endpoint, where a biomarker is really some specific aspect of physiology or disease state, versus an outcome assessment that is often then more a high level measurement of how that patient feels, functions, and survives. And so in the biomarker bucket, you're seeing lots of things like gait metrics, or specific blood pressure metrics, or these kinds of things, reaction times on a specific cognitive test, as was outlined earlier, whereas an outcome assessment will be more a reflection of that patient's individual subjective perception. And both of these paths lead towards becoming an endpoint. But the data that you will collect and the studies that you will perform in order to support those, a measure becoming a basis for decision making, will be different depending on how you actually, or what path is more appropriate to the work that you're doing. And of course, something like software as a medical device, where the analytics itself becomes part of an intervention, whether that's diagnostic or as a digital therapeutic intervention. Again, there are paths outlaid for that. And so really understanding what the intention of your system is very, very important from the start, because that really defines the whole journey ahead of you. And so I'm including in my talk links to further papers and further reading if anybody's interested. And because of course, we're just touching on a lot of these topics. We also talked a lot in the paper around, where does the data come from, and how, what issues and hurdles are associated with particular data sources. Just in one of the previous talks, again, there was a discussion point about active versus passive data collection. Of course, there's also hybrid options. Also many data collection systems these days, some are single modal, classic accelerometry, but increasingly there are devices coming both onto the commercially available market and into the medical grade market that are multimodal and will allow you to capture multiple data streams at the same time. And again, choosing the right technology for answering the question that you have is of course critical. We also talked a bit about PGHD. So this is person-generated health data. And this is an umbrella term that is becoming increasingly used in the field, and it refers to really all the data that comes out of a patient's everyday life. So this is, objective data from wearables, environmental data, contextual data, and importantly also self-reports coming from this data. So many apps, for example, these days will enable objective data collection in terms of the sensors in a smartphone interactions with the app, but it will also allow the participants themselves to contribute their perceptions, their ratings of their symptoms, and so forth. And the combination of that objective and subjective data is very, very powerful, especially as we start to look at more outcome relevant measures that are looking at things like quality of life, depression, fatigue, these sorts of symptoms that are extremely quality of life relevant, but very hard to measure with a single mode of data. And so we go into depth into this on the paper and some of the different approaches that you can take. But perhaps the meat of the paper is really some highlighted challenges, and I list them out here. And these are, of course, not all of the hurdles that you might face in the development of a digital measure, but these are the ones that really, as I said, we felt that analytics has a particular role to play in, and really should be influencing your decision-making, your strategy during that work. But for the purpose of this talk, just for timeliness, I want to just highlight three. So patient centricity, performance metrics, and interpretability. So patient centricity is really something that is near and dear to my heart. And it always surprises me actually how often digital measures or generally, clinical studies, any system that's going to be used in a healthcare setting, how often they are developed with very little or no patient interaction and input. Or participants, so all the other stakeholders that might be involved in the use of that system, whether that's patients themselves, caregivers, healthcare providers. But if you talked to like classic software developers, they would never consider developing a website or an app or any other system without talking to the people who are going to be using it. So it always surprises me a little bit that is so standardized in software development, and yet we see it so rarely in the development of digital health applications. And so I wanted to highlight here a paper from my colleague Bray and Jen from the Biome Society called Measuring What Matters. And here they outline a framework for how to involve participants in the development of digital measures. And it really starts from the top in terms of identifying a meaningful aspect of health. And this is a high-level concept that is subjectively important to that particular patient. And how do you then work down from that high-level concept into a specific concept of interest and ultimately into an endpoint or a measure that you're actually going to capture, and the way in which you're going to capture it in the study or in the application, because of course how you actually capture it needs to be tailored to the people who are going to be using it. Again, the talk earlier gave a great example of that, talking about why they had chosen to develop on iOS. Again, if you're dealing with people who are either limited in terms of their motor function or in terms of their sight, having a very big, clear screen is going to be really critical to that person interacting with that application. And again, developing or collecting data from a wearable again, it's exactly the same situation. You know, if you're dealing, let's say, with elderly patients or patients with disabilities, you know, don't
Yeah,
give
in the
them
interest
3
of
different
time,
devices.
do you want to hurry a bit? I think we
Sure,
are running short on time.
I'll wrap up. Good. So yeah, so here's just an example of how you can actually work through that process, specifically thinking about activity and walking capacity. And again, I'd encourage everybody to read that paper. And in terms of choosing the right metrics, again, you know, you can of course optimize any system in a number of different directions. And so here I actually want to give a great shout out to Mariko and her talk earlier, because I thought it's a really nice example. So Mariko has been working in my lab over the last few months, and when you're talking about depression, you know, the cost of a false negative is of course very, very high. You know, if someone is experiencing a depressive event and you do not recognize that, the cost can be very, very high. Whereas a false positive, and you ask someone, hey, you doing okay? And they say, yeah, I'm fine, is very, very small. And so here we really optimize for sensitivity and for precision. And of course, you could go in different directions in different settings, but thinking about your metrics is of course very, very important whenever you're setting out. And so just to close, again, coming back to interpretability, again, this is where it comes back to whether we're talking about an outcome or a digital biomarker. Typically, biomarkers have to be interpretable. They have to be directly interpretable. So this is why we talk about steps per day or blood pressure or pulse volumes. But an outcome can be something more abstract or a rating scale. And so if you think that it's not possible to capture that meaningful aspect of health in an interpretable way, you might need to think about focusing on more of an outcome approach. And I include here at the bottom links to 2 papers that talk about practical applications and implementation of those 2 different strategies. And so with that, yeah,